Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to Student Voices inside SCMA. My name is Lauren Shea Warner, and I am the Membership Engagement and Stewardship Coordinator. Today's program features Annalise Edwards, Class of 23J, and Danielle Carrabino, Curator of Painting and Sculpture. Next slide, please. Before I hand this over to our panelists, a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to type in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. Annalise and Danielle will be following along and look forward to answering your questions or any questions you may have. I will now turn it over to Danielle.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry. I'm having some technical difficulties. Okay. Hi. Sorry about that. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see you as I share my screen again. As Lauren mentioned, we will be hearing from Annalise Edwards today. She has been my extraordinary research assistant since the beginning of this academic year, and we will just hear briefly about two projects of the many that she has helped me with. I think one of the things that has been crucial for Annalise to learn is that curators, like most people in the museum profession, do an array of things throughout the course of the day, week, year. So this is just a slice of what she has done, but it's really part of a much larger picture. And she's gotten, I think, a taste of a lot of the curatorial activities that go on at SCMA. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Annalise to talk about two of her projects. The first is a recent acquisition. Thank you.
Hello. So my name is Annalise. I am a 2023J, as was already said. I'm from New York City, and I'm an art history major and a sociology minor. So that's just a little intro about me. So yeah, thank you all for joining us. I hope that I can give you a good idea of just some of the things that I've been working on with Danielle. So yeah, I guess I will start with the skull acquisition. Yeah, so you can just keep it there, I think, for now. Yeah, so the first project I'll be talking about involves my research relating to the museum's recent acquisition of an 18th century snuff box in the shape of a skull, which is pictured on the left. And the second project I'll talk about today will involve my research on a sculpture that will be on display in an exhibition that's coming soon to the museum, which Danielle is curating and I'm helping her with, and it's called Brought to Life, Painted Wood Sculpture from Europe from 1300 to 1700. So change the slide now. Yes, okay, so first I'll just jump into the snuff skull and its acquisition. So just for some background on what this object is all about, the Vanitas snuff box in the shape of a skull, it came to us from a gallery in Chicago and features Vanitas imagery, as it's in the name. So it was most often employed in 17th and 18th century still life paintings. Vanitas refers to human mortality and the transience of material goods. It derives from biblical references to vanity, and it aims to remind viewers of the fleeting benefit of giving into material and superficial desires. Vanitas imagery is also closely related to the movement relating to Memento Mori, which is a Latin phrase, and that means remember you must die. So that centers more around death and decomposition rather than vanity and material life. And I just have some examples of how that's been used in paintings in the past. Yeah, so next slide. So I began my research on the snuff skull last semester in the weeks leading up to an acquisitions meeting with museum staff, where the object would be presented with the question of whether it would be a useful and educational fit for the SCMA. So my tasks as a student assistant in this project were to research similar objects in other museums' collections and note how those objects were displayed and how the museums approached the themes of Vanitas and Memento Mori. And Danielle and I were thinking that it would be cool to present it in the 18th century gallery in a Wunderkammer, Kunstkammer, cabinet of curiosities sort of display, example of which I have presented here, with other kind of funky objects to show kind of the beginning of museums, and then also thinking about colonialism, because the two tie in together. And those ideas definitely resonate with some of the other examples that I found in other museums. And I'll dive into that now. So next slide. Yeah, so I'm just going to show a couple of comparative examples that I found, because there were many. So these will just be like kind of case studies of the larger research that I did. So the first one is this ivory skull that's at the Metropolitan Museum. In my research, I discovered that it was presented in a Kunstkammer display in a Bartholomew Sprenger exhibition that was in 2014 at the Met. So that Kunstkammer display was made specifically for that show because Sprenger had been a court artist for King Rudolph II, who was known for his princely Kunstkammer collection. And so it was like modeled off of that. And then, you know, something else that I found was relevant was the website text relating to this ivory skull, which states, although replicas of skulls were often kept as reminders of the imminence of death, the obsessive anatomically correct detailing of this skull, both inside and out, suggests that it was a curiosity intended for a cabinet of exotica. So that quote, I think, definitely resonates with our skull, which is also anatomically correct and also relates to the imminence of death. I think this example confirms that objects like this were presented in cabinets of curiosities. So next example, next slide. Another comparison that I found was this Vanitas sculpture that's at the Chrysler Museum. It's made out of pine wood, so wood just like our sculpture, and it's split between a living man on the right half and a skull on the left, with a snake jutting in and out of the skull's openings. You know, I thought that this was very similar to our sculpture in its representation of, you know, Vanitas imagery in life and death, and also in the depiction of the snake. So I think if you go to the next slide, you can see the snake in our object. So on the top of our snuff box is a scene of, this is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden, and the snake is right in the middle of that composition. So, you know, obviously there's like a lot to do with the snake here, and that connects to the snake in the object that I found at the Chrysler Museum. So I thought that that was, you know, symbolically and visually very meaningful and a great comparison to our piece. So you can go back to that previous slide. In my research on this specific object, I was looking also at the provenance to try to figure out, you know, where it came from and how it's maybe been presented in the past. And I found that it was previously presented at Kunstkammer Georg Lau, which is a German gallery art shop sort of thing that's based on Wunderkammer, Kunstkammer, cabinet of curiosities sort of aesthetics. And I just took a shot from the website. That's an example of some of Lau's Kunstkammer, I guess, displays. And, you know, there wasn't a picture of this object specifically in one of the cabinets, but I think you can totally imagine how it would be displayed here. And it would also make sense for our snuff box skull that we acquired to be presented in a similar way. Yeah, so next slide. I guess one more. Yeah, and beyond the research that I did, looking at other examples of objects like the snuff box, I also assisted in coming up with a justification for the acquisition's approval. So my work in this part of the project centered more around my perspective as a student in the museum, as a student visitor. And I wrote up my thoughts on why it would be beneficial to have this object on display in the SCMA, you know, specifically considering the ways that it could be used in a classroom or for teaching purposes. So, you know, in the context of those considerations. I also provided my thoughts on the best ways to present the object, for teaching purposes. And so for this task, I physically went into the 18th century gallery at the museum to look at the artworks that are currently on display in our collection that could either visually or, iconographically relate to the snuff box nicely, or at least like provide some context to it in a way that's, more unique to Smith's collection. So, thinking about why specifically it would be good to have at Smith and like how it could be used in the context of our collection. I just have a couple of examples of pieces that I found in the 18th century gallery. So on the left, we have this woodland still life. And its label text in the museum mentions how it portrays the transient nature of life and how decaying flowers or industrious bugs eating holes in leaves and fruit are there to remind the viewer of mortality. So, I thought that this would work really great with the snuff box to contextualize the themes of mortality that it presents. And it's also definitely interesting to note that there's a hunting snake on the lower right of the composition. And I believe that the label text also mentions how this snake threatens this like scene of paradise, which I think could also refer to the snuff box's scene of Adam and Eve on the top of the skull. And then just another example is this fruit dish with Siegburger jug. I just thought that this presented another, really nice example of decay and death, with the fallen flowers and leaves, and then also the insects. So next slide. So to conclude my work on the Vanitas snuff box in the shape of a skull, I wrote a blog post for the SCMA website, kind of encompassing all of my research. So this post discusses more in depth the history of snuff, used for sniffing rather than smoking, and snuff boxes, and provides additional information on the different contexts of viewing objects like our snuff skull. So, thinking about it on display in a museum versus in someone's home versus in a cabinet of curiosity versus in a person's hand if they're holding it, like in the images on the right. So you're just thinking about the ways of viewership and how that might affect one's relationship with the object. So writing the blog post was a really interesting experience. It allowed me to consider how to make discussions about art more accessible to an audience that might not know anything about, the specific object or the histories relating to this object. I think at first I found this kind of challenging because, as an art history student, the papers that I write for my classes are not necessarily conceived of with a public audience in mind. So it's definitely useful to develop that writing skill because I think that's kind of crucial to some types of museum work. If you're thinking about like labels or wall texts in galleries or things that you're posting on museum websites, whether it's a blog post or relating to like an exhibition, you can't really have that art historical jargon that not necessarily everybody knows who's like not in this academic setting. And I definitely didn't know all of that language when before I came to Smith either. So it was definitely useful to get that sort of perspective in the writing part of this project. But I guess in conclusion, working on the snuff box was one of the first things that I did at the museum. I think this project it gave me a really great introduction to, the inner workings of museums and acquisition processes. And it really allowed me to like jump in head first. It was really cool to not only do research on an object, but to also be able to write about it in a really interesting way. And I really enjoyed doing work like from a student perspective. And I felt like that perspective was really valued, even though this, at this point, it was still very early on in my internship. So I'm really grateful to Danielle for having faith in me with that project and just letting me kind of dive in head first. So I guess next slide.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to come back in. Thank you so much for that, Annalise. We will be switching gears just a moment. So as I said, these are just two of many projects. So from acquisitions, we are going now to exhibitions. And as Annalise already mentioned, this is an exhibition that will be opening later this year. So in September 16th, and it will last through the entire academic year and even through the summer until August 6th, 2023. So again, kind of shifting gears, this is another project that Annalise provided a lot of support and research and help. And again, that student perspective is so important for us. And so without further ado, I will let her present her research on the Falconer, which will be included in this exhibition. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, so my work for the exhibition has involved a lot of different tasks and is definitely still ongoing. I researched last semester a couple of objects that are going to be in the exhibition, one of which is the Falconer that I'll talk about today. So this is a sculpture from Europe. The country of origin and the specific date when it was made are still unknown, but those were the questions that kind of drove my research in this project. And that was like what I was working towards, and that's what I'll kind of dive into today. So we decided that the best way to go about this project, assigning culture and a date, was to see if the Falconer's fashion could reveal anything about where he was from, because you can see it's kind of a very unique outfit here that he has going on. And its provenance was kind of confusing and misleading in trying to get to the bottom of that. And I think the previous owners were convinced that it was Catalonian, but that has since been disproven. So, the answer still remains open. And we've narrowed it down a little bit, but this project is still ongoing. Yeah, so next slide. Okay. Yeah, so here I have some closer up images of his dress. So you can see that it's rather distinct, especially his boots and his belt and his headdress. And notably the square buckle on the belt, and especially how thick it is. I found that was very unusual compared to other Falconer's outfits that I'll show in a minute. So in my comparative research, I discovered a number of paintings and tapestries that provided useful visual evidence of both similar pieces and pieces that were really different from this. And it's definitely worth noting that the painted aspects of this sculpture, such as the checker printed shirt or tunic that he's got going on, could have been later additions because of the paint. So they could have painted over something else. So it's not necessarily like the best way to go in determining like where he's from or when he was made. So I was primarily focusing on the actual like structural, the physical structure of the clothing itself. So next slide. So I'm just going to show two examples of some of the comparisons that I found, just because there's a lot and it's just a lot of material. So this first example is a scene of the Adoration of the Magi, and I have a detail on the right as well of there's a falconer in this painting. And so here we see in the overall composition, there's a falconer and he's pictured far to the left. He's wearing kind of a similar headpiece to our falconer, although his belt is much thinner and has a small round clasp, whereas our falconer's belt, as you can remember, is much larger and rectangular and has that rectangular clasp. So that wasn't exactly a great overlap, but I think what's most notable about the comparisons that I found is that in all the images of falconers from this time period, they're all wearing gloves. And our falconer is not wearing gloves. So I think that kind of is revealing of maybe a prior use or prior history that is unclear based on his like current representation. But I think this outfit was probably the closest that I could find to ours. But it still is not like giving, the most conclusive results. And I think that's been a common experience with objects like this. So next slide. Yes, so another example I thought I would show is this falconer with two ladies and a foot soldier. This is a tapestry at the Art Institute of Chicago. So I also have a detail of the falconer on the right, as you can see, so you can see his outfit better. He is also wearing a glove on the hand where he's holding the falconer. So you can see that that is definitely like an essential part of the falconer's outfits. And the neckline and the sleeves, I think this is more similar to the painting of the Adoration of the Magi, which I found. So you see that there's like a V neckline and then a V shape on the sleeves. So it seems like this might have been a more common sort of style among falconers, and could also maybe speak to the unusual clothing of our falconer, and maybe revealing that maybe he was not a falconer to begin with. So you can also see in this example, he wears he wears ankle-length shoes rather than boots, with a clasp over the top of the foot. And the belt, I think this belt is more similar to our falconer's belt because it's thicker, but this one also has a round clasp. So there are interesting similarities and differences, and from those you can raise further questions about the origin of our sculpture. So next slide. Yeah, so these are just two examples of a much larger research project, but I think the most important takeaway so far is that falconers definitely wore gloves, and I think that would have been part of the representation. So I think that reveals a major detail about this sculpture. It doesn't really make much sense that he'd be holding the falcon with his bare hands. So perhaps he was originally holding on to something else, or was in a different context. And it's also important to note that in our object file, which is kind of like the equivalent of our archives on all the works in our collections, there were previous theories that his hands, the falcon itself, and I think also his feet were modern additions to the sculpture and were not actually part of the original sculpture. So I think the discrepancies that I found in the examples here are they could possibly support those theories. Yeah, but the research on the sculpture is definitely still developing, and it will all work towards its label text in the exhibition this fall. So it's all going to be going towards the dating and the culture of the work. We still don't really have the concrete answers that we really wanted about his nationality, but we do have more clues about his associations with falconry, which is still helpful in getting to the bottom of what his story is all about, who he is and what he's doing. Yeah, so that is the end of my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Annalise. I'll just stop sharing for a moment so we can just talk a little bit more. So just to kind of generate a little bit of discussion before we open it up to our audience for more questions and comments. Was there anything, I'll start with the stuff box. Was there anything interesting or surprising to you about kind of the behind the scenes, the way that museums acquire works for the collection? So maybe what you learned in that process.
Yeah, I think I definitely, like before starting the internship, I definitely did not realize how many steps are involved and like how much work actually goes into acquiring a piece. I don't know why. I guess I just thought like if you saw something that you thought would be great in your collection, you could just point at it and then it would magically appear in the galleries.
Yes.
But like it's not like necessarily a natural like question that comes to you like as a visitor when you're just like in the galleries. You don't like think, oh, like I wonder how long it actually took to like get the rights to this piece, like actually purchase it and make sure that like everybody in the museum is also on board, because there's just like so many presentations and conversations that happen with like a lot of different people in the museum. It's not just like up to you, which I also like didn't really consider before. It's not just the curators who's making decisions like that. You know, you also have to like think about, especially for museums associated with colleges, you know, like the educational purpose and the value to the student body and like to the specific audience. So I thought that that was just really cool to get an inside look at, you know, especially doing the stuff for the snuff box and like writing up my like student justification. Like I just thought that that was really cool to see and something that I hadn't really like considered before. I think a lot of people probably don't.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to reiterate how important it is to have your perspective as a student, as you know, one of our main audiences, that's really crucial. So we really appreciate all the work that you did in helping us to think about it from your perspective. A quick question about the Falconer before we open it up. So beyond your research on this object, what are the other ways you have participated in the planning of the Brought to Life exhibition? And what have you learned so far about kind of, you know, similar to the first question, what that process entails?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of different types of things for the Brought to Life exhibition. You know, I think it started last semester with the research on the Falconer and another object that's going to be in the exhibition, the Circumcision of Christ. And so that was just kind of like my little, I was opening the door to a world of many more assignments that were all really, really cool and but just very diverse. So, you know, for those two objects, the Falconer and the Circumcision, I'm going to be writing the labels for those for the show, and I'll be working on section text as well for more contextual information about deforestation in the Middle Ages that I just did research on, I think a couple weeks ago. So that'll kind of contextualize the use of wood in the exhibition sculptures, because that's such a central part of the exhibition. And I guess aside from that, there was also, I helped with the preparation of mock-ups for each of the sculptures, and we just had a little powwow, I think last week, you know, placing out or figuring out where all the labels were going to go and where the section texts were going to go on the walls. And we also discussed the configuration of the alcove that's going to present sculpting and painting tools in a display case. And I think also the video about the object's conservation. So just a lot of a lot of different types of projects. They're not all research-based, which is really cool to just see like all the different type of, you know, I guess collaborative and like really creative aspects of this work that I also didn't really know about. I think something that I've learned, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just how much work goes into like one small detail on a label or just like a piece of information. And I think that's really clear with the Falconer. You know, there's a lot of work there and we still don't have like concrete answers.
Yes.
But it's all just, it's for the label. So I think that was just like really, it was interesting to like be a part of that process. And then also just like learning about the general logistics of putting together an exhibition, you know, like thinking about the groupings of the objects like thematically and how they all relate to each other. And then also, you know, just things like sightlines and placement of text and accessibility, whether that's like physical accessibility or accessibility in terms of like language and just like historical knowledge and, you know, background information, just all things that like you're kind of constantly considering. So yeah, it's just, there's just so many moving parts. And it's just been really great to see like how they all fit together, you know, and it's just like being a part of that collaboration. It's just been really awesome.
Yeah, that's, you said the key word, collaboration, because I think because of the complexity of putting together an exhibition or even acquiring a work of art. We don't do this alone by any means. And again, I'll say, many times your input, your research, your help has been crucial, as is the rest of our museum team, all of our colleagues, and in every single department, every single individual has an impact on what we do and valuable information that we take into consideration. So it's definitely a team effort. We do have a few questions, but quickly, I just wanted to know how this type of museum work is different or similar to your work in your art history classes, and kind of how that translates or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was realizing as I was putting together this slideshow that I guess maybe for these specific projects, and I think for a lot of the other stuff that I've done in terms of research at the museum, has been like comparative research. And I definitely think that that's something that I do in my art history classes, especially with like visual analysis. I think that's kind of like inherent in the major. But I would say that the approach to the research, I think, is very different.
Yes.
For the research the comparative research of like that I'm presenting on today, it's more about like, does this specific detail exist elsewhere? And, what does that look like? Or when was this made? And can I determine when it was made based on other examples of this style or this type of object? But, in my classes, like comparative research is definitely based more on like visual analysis and not necessarily trying to figure out what it or when it was made or where it's from, but using that information that's already been uncovered to like discuss the similarities and differences in a more theoretical sense. So, I think I'm doing like very similar research on like a basic level, but the approaches and the research questions definitely diverge from each other. And so it's been, I think at first it was like kind of not like necessarily difficult, but just like it was a new experience of art historical research that I hadn't really done before. Just approaching it from a very different angle. It's just been very interesting.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I am conscious of the time, so I will open it up now to questions. Please, as Lauren had said, put your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. I will just be moderating. So the first question is from one of our fellow curators, Emma Chubb, who says, Annalise, thank you for a great presentation. I appreciated how you talked about the ways that writing for the blog differs from writing art history papers, especially in thinking about audience. I'm curious if you find that your research and writing projects at SCMA are having an impact on your research questions and writing for courses, and if so, how? So not unrelated to our last question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it definitely has affected how I think about writing my papers. And what's actually interesting is that for one of my art history classes this semester, our final paper is actually a blog post, which is kind of just a funny coincidence. I'm like, oh, I've actually done this before.
Wonderful.
But like my professor is wanting us to, consider audience and think about like who you're writing for, and like tailoring your writing style and like how much detail you go into depending on that audience. And yeah, it's just, I'm now forgetting the question.
Okay, it's how you might kind of pull the research and writing that you've done at the museum into your courses. So kind of almost the reverse of what we were talking about, but how does this experience maybe inform your classwork?
Mm.
So yeah, you definitely answered the blog.
Yeah, I think I come at my research for my courses now kind of differently. I think it's kind of hard to explain, but it definitely has impacted my approach. I think I'm much more thorough now. I think looking for all these specific details or reading all these like papers and looking at comparative examples for the museum has made me approach my coursework thinking like, oh, I don't know, I I'm not necessarily always trying to get like the big picture, but like maybe I need to be more thorough and really look for like specific details or just like littler things that could be useful to like an argument that I'd be making about a piece. I think it's made me think about just like being more thorough as I'm like doing my research or doing readings and stuff. And I think that's not always like emphasized just like from the classes themselves.
Yeah,
It's
it's
always, like,
definitely
asking, what's the main idea, but that's not
right.
necessarily always the most important part.
Right. It's definitely related. And we all kind of start out there as art historians, or many of us, I should say, not all of us, but many of us start out there kind of being trained in a certain way. But then it does force you, as you said, to think about different audiences, but also look at things in a slightly different way, which I always like to think about kind of making a visual argument in an exhibition or a display space. You know, you're not using words as much. Labels are very short often. And so you've done a great job of making that transition, which is not easy, you know, to write differently after you've been trained to write a certain way, or even look slightly differently, you know, after being trained in a certain way. So kudos to you. We don't have any other questions. So I think if we are not, if we're able to just kind of, if you'll indulge me, I'll ask one more question of Annalise, and that is, I wonder if you are considering a career path in museums, or if we've completely, or if I have completely frightened you away from that.
No, I think this has definitely made me much more interested in a career in museums.
Great.
I think that has been an interest of mine, like kind of since arriving at Smith. You know, one of the main appeals of Smith to me, like when I was applying, was the museum and how central that is to the curriculum of the art history department, and just being able to see how that actually works and be able to like be a part of it from the inside has definitely made me like much more interested in being able to do that as a career. It's also just been really cool to see how many different types of jobs there are in museums. Like it's not just curation. There's a lot of other type of work that goes on behind the scenes that I'm now realizing is also a possibility for me. So it's just been cool to like, you know, see what else is out there in the world of museums. And I'm definitely excited to, you know, explore all the possibilities.
Yeah, great. I'm so pleased. But it's a great point you make, because it is really not known, unfortunately, how many different roles you know, there are available in museums, and each one of them is integral, and they're all kind of, I don't know, behind the scenes. Sometimes it's hard to get a sense of them until you're actually in a museum. At least that was my experience as well. So I'm really excited that we're able to have you on board so that you can get, you know, kind of experience doing that, but also to look around and to see what other options are out there. I think that's important, not to kind of get too, you know, pigeonholed from the beginning, but to explore the options. So again, thank you so much. Thank you for your continued work. I'm so lucky to have Annalise on board and throughout actually the summer. So she'll continue to help me with the exhibition, but all the other things that we haven't talked about as well. I think I will throw it back to Lauren at this point, because I don't see any other questions. So thank you all. Let me share my screen again, please, so that I can just pull up the slide that she would like to talk about. And thank you all. And there you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you, Annalise, for your wonderful presentation. Let me just see. Yep. Awesome. Yep, so yes, thank you, everyone. And if you could go to the next slide. Yep, perfect. So we hope you can join us next Tuesday on April 19th. We are going to be having a presentation featuring let's see, Moza Malapa, class of 2022 with curator April Galat. And Moza will present their proposal of an acquisition for the museum. And we will also have other programs coming up later this spring and summer. So please feel free to click onto our social media, or if you have not already, to receive our email communications on our website. And finally, I just wanted to thank our fabulous members and donors for all of their support. And if you have any questions, or if you have questions about membership or ways to get involved, please feel free to visit our website and email SCMA members at smith.edu. And we hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.